James D'Amato, the president of the One Shot Network, host of One Shot and Campaign. But here, I am just here as your friend and good buddy because we're going to be having a chat with some of our friends, and we're going to be doing that for charity. But before I jump into talking about any of that, I wanted to give my guests a chance to introduce themselves. Gian, let's start with you. You are sitting to the left of me.
Awesome. Hi, my name is Jian Shim. I'm a game designer. I've been working in independent game design since 2018. I recently successfully funded a game on Kickstarter called Wait for Me, which is about time traveling through your own personal history. And I also have a game in the ultimate micro RPG anthology called A Green Hour. Yeah.
And hi, my name is Jay Dragon. I use no pronouns, which is that if you want to talk about me, try to just use my name if possible, or like I guess they them if it's starting to get a logistical hellscape. Um, I am also a game designer. I am the head publisher at Possum Creek Games. I recently kickstarted Wander Home, which Gian is also involved in, and I also have a game in the Ultimate Micro RPG book.
Ooh,
Mine is
you
Endwell.
have one!
I have it right in front of me. Yeah, I grabbed my copy. So it's useful. It's very beautiful. It's a very beautiful book.
I'll
I
have to
have
take
not
your
just
word
sang
for it.
Maxim in it.
Both Gian and I don't have a copy yet.
You don't have a copy? Oh my
No.
lordy, it's so nice. Oh, James, the perforated pages are really something else.
I am so excited. I want to. I know. Like I think I get multiple copies of it. I do want to take one copy and just laminate everything in it so I can
Oh,
truck it around to
mhm.
cons and whatnot. But
That's a really good idea. Yeah,
mm,
I want to get a
mm.
second copy just because I want to be able to like tear the pages out of one of them without like feeling bad. But
Um,
it's mhm.
well, cool. We'll get into talking about the book. But first, I wanted to mention one of the reasons that we're here is One Shot, the network, is currently supporting a charity drive run by World Builders. If you don't know World Builders, they are a fundraising charity, basically a pass through charity that gloms onto different causes and harnesses the power of good hearted nerds to raise funds for different, like, great causes. And the cause that they do at the end of every year is Heifer International. If you don't know Heifer, they are a really special organization. They fight extreme poverty and create food stability for people around the world by connecting them with sustainable resources and education. They're not the sort of charity that comes and drops a bunch of supplies or like a water filtration system or something and doesn't explain how to use it and just disappears into the night. They're the sort of charity that will give a family a goat, allowing them to get food because that goat will be a pregnant goat and produce milk and hopefully other goats. And then they will go into that community and help that community do things like give someone the education that they need to provide veterinary care for those goats, and connect other people in that area with like just a network of education and resources to help create an economy of both caring and like sustainable resources so those people can change their lives in a permanent way that makes them better forever. Which is just such a lovely thing. And one of my favorite things about it is when you contribute money to them, they frame it in terms of the resources that you are creating for their organization. So if you give them, I believe it is $120, that is one goat that goes to a lucky family somewhere in need. So, how many opportunities do you get to say, oh, I'm going to spend $20 and give someone some bees? You can give people, a heaping scoopful of bees and can accomplish some really wonderful things at the same time. Now, because we're doing this through World Builders is not just a pass through charity, they are also the wildest raffle you've ever heard of. World Builders offers everyone who donates $10 or more entries into a massive pool of prizes that include games, that include professional services from writers, that include books, all sorts of cool and exciting things. And if you want to get involved and enter yourself to win some of those raffles, you can head to the One Shot team page because One Shot is also offering goodies. If you raise money on our page, if we hit certain stretch goals and whatnot, we provide extra productions. We're currently around $100 away from me having to release a short story set in the world of Sphere from our Skyjacks podcast. I am currently revising that right now, so it will be ready to go out to y'all very soon if you hit that goal. I'm excited to share it, and I'm excited for all of you to get cool prizes. So if you're interested, please head over to bit.ly/OSNENDS2020. That is bit.ly/OSNENDS2020. You can also it's the link that's right beneath me on our outlet or overlay here, and of course Jay was kind enough to pop it into the chat for us. So yeah, with all of that said and all that out of the way, it's time to talk, folks. And, I brought you both on because you both contributed games to the Ultimate Micro RPG book, but I think your games have a very cool, thematic conversation with one another. You both opted to do two-player games, and they're two-player games about people's relationship to other people, especially intimate relationships, and kind of your relationship with yourself and your body and identity. They were just very cool, different takes on the same thing. And I wanted to point out that when I approached people for the Ultimate Micro RPG book, I didn't give anybody requirements of things they had to do. Everybody's game design was a creative blank check, and this is what they brought to me. So it is very cool that two designers happened upon these themes at once. So I would love to hear basically a brief explanation of what your games are so we can dive in and get to talking. Jay, let's start with you because we started with Gian last time.
So I wrote Annadale by Sea, which is a letter writing game. It's the only one in the book that is about two people who used to live together in the small town of Annadale by Sea. One of them a couple weeks ago moved to the big city. And it's a game where you're writing letters back and forth about sort of the experiences you're having and the ways in which you're changing independent of each other, and also the way in which you're slowly drifting apart and the things you're leaving unsaid. It's a bit inspired by stuff like Ben Roswell's We Build Private Cathedrals and those sorts of letter writing, romance, not romance, kind of playing in that space games.
Very cool. And Gian, please explain your game.
Yeah, I'll try. It's also a two-player game. It's called A Green Hour. In the PDF galley that I have, it's on page 47. I don't know what page it is in the physical book, but
45.
45. Thank you. Each player is creating a character who is the scion, the end of an ancient lineage, whose sole duty is to enter into an arranged marriage, and on the night of their union, they or are you going to reject them? Are you both going to agree to what you do, or are
Hold
you
on, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
It seems like chat is saying they've lost audio on you.
Oh.
Oh,
Okay.
what?
We can hear you. We can hear you good.
Yeah. Okay, should I unplug my headphones and see if my laptop works?
That might be a James issue because we're hearing you fine, so the audio
Yeah,
is coming through to us.
I can hear you.
Yeah.
Oh.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, hold on. Let me fix that. Okay. So
shit.
it is when I change screens.
Oh, okay.
But it is going to be too much a hassle to fix that right now.
Sure.
So rather
Why
than
don't I
doing
take off my headphones?
No, it's
no, no,
not
no,
you.
no, no. It's not you.
Oh, okay.
It is me. It is me. It is just like a logistical hassle. Let's have you start at the beginning. I'm just going to
Sure.
add a window capture to our screen, and it will look slightly uglier than it might have otherwise.
It's okay.
That's all right.
No worries. Um, where was? Oh, okay. So starting from the top, A Green Hour is a two-player game. Each player will create a character that is the scion of an ancient line, the end of the line of their family. And each family comes from a tradition of protecting the land. So the scions of these lines enter into an arranged marriage, and on the night of their union, they become an old land god who's sworn to protect and steward the land forever. You have a choice as players and characters whether you want to assume the mantle and take on the responsibility together, or whether you want to reject it. And your decisions can be different decisions, or you can come to an agreement between the two of you. If you do agree to become the god, then you'll merge and you'll never be people again. And so to accept the responsibility is to agree to forego your humanity, to reject it, and to let the land, fall prey to whatever will happen to it is to retain your personhood. Um, and I took on two major challenges with it. For me personally, at the time that James approached me, it was my first ever dice rolling game. I'd never designed a game that had dice in it before, and it was also my first ever game on like an epic scale. A lot of what I write tends to be very personal and individual, and this was the first time I was writing about like gods and ancient rituals and things like that.
That is fascinating because I felt your game was still very personal and individual.
Yeah.
Even if there were big consequences, it still felt very at home and very small within the worlds of these two people and their relationship. And obviously the same thing for Andale by Sea. Both of these games really struck me as a cool conversation note because they're both about like Andale by Sea. The end game for it, the way you end the game is when you don't want to start, like when you want to stop writing letters, you stop writing letters as these characters. These characters eventually drift apart. Either one of the players dies, or you end the game by the characters actually falling out of contact with one another. Which is about them changing as people, becoming different people, really, and revaluing like this new life they have over that relationship that they shared, which is in your game, Gian, like you've got two characters who do the opposite. They say goodbye to the people they used to be and perhaps adopt this new mantle of shared godhood. Like there's a lot of like cool marriage stuff tied into that. Both of them are really neat. I wanted to know, Jay, like what drew you to this letter writing format and this investigation of two people kind of drifting apart?
So I think I wanted to write a letter writing game for a while, and I kind of used this as my chance to. Because I've always been really interested in the idea of the way in which letters, like, there's a way in which things are not said in them as much as they are said. Like, the decision to, like the way in which, like, we make choices about what we do or don't say in the words we say to each other. I feel like letter writing kind of brings that to the forefront. And it's weird reading my game and also reading Gion's game and knowing that they were written before quarantine. But certainly I feel like reading either of these and like they feel so 2020 in that way, where like Annadale by Sea, at least, like it's a game about missing someone you care for tremendously and growing as a person without them and not knowing if you'll ever get the chance to reconnect again, but also wanting to know what it would mean to reconnect, but also being like afraid to articulate that. And so I feel like letter writing is like a spot where you can do that because it's really sort of like a very long-term way of playing. It's also a very like, I think almost like idealizing nostalgic way. Like for me it comes from like like old like sending emails to people like back like when I was 16, like sending emails to a long distance crush or whatever. But like I feel like it's still it's still got that feeling of like the like, oh, you're so far away, I don't really like there are things you're choosing not to say in this, but I'm sending it to you.
That was one of my favorite mechanical like aspects of your
Mm-hmm.
game is that in Annandale by the Sea or by Sea, the one of the world building instructions players have is that they decide on topics that exist in the world that they will not talk about, in addition to ones that they are entitled to talk about,
Mm-hmm.
which like it is such a clever way to create that. I absolutely adore the kind of Schrodinger's liminal space certain world building ideas exist in games.
Mm-hmm.
In that, there are truths that remain unspoken between players that both players are operating under the same or similar assumptions with.
Mm-hmm.
And this game like brings that out to the forefront and turns that into a mechanic. I think it
Mm-hmm.
really effectively captures that letter writing feeling, that correspondence feeling that you're going for, and also just like takes advantage of this really cool aspect of how we play games in the meta, which I just loved.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I'm really proud of that mechanic. I also love how I feel like I don't know. I was when I'm thinking about Gian your game, there's an element there where oh, what was it exactly? Just the way in which like it's dealing a lot with these very sort of large scale questions, but it's always kept very personally grounded. And that was the thing I really, really love about your game is the way like it is a game ultimately about like the fate of like a community and a kingdom and like these lineages, but like you don't. It's not about like you're not those things. It's not this macro level. It's on a very like you are two people in this moment. And I feel like Annadale I see is also kind of trying to think about that in terms of like um there's references to like the war or like there's like references to like increased police presence, which like writing in 2019 I
Yeah,
don't know but like a lot of that stuff where it's like there's the tension of like you live in a world that is doing these very climactic explosive terrifying things on a large scale, but you're on a very very small scale, and so like the way you do or don't talk about it is like in the letters.
yeah, and I think Gion's game enters this aspect of the conversation a really interesting point in that it's not brought into the mechanical forefront in the same way, but both of the characters in Gion's game are meeting each other on their wedding night, and it's like not even just their wedding night and like consummation is on the table. When they consummate this marriage, they will shed their mortal forms. Like it is, there's so much writing on that, and we get to see the scenes of them like preparing for that. Like one of my favorite like visuals I had is in my head. I'm just imagining like these nervous people who are about to take on this massive cultural obligation and possibly save the world, and they are going through these moments where they're doing actions that they might be familiar with because they've prepared, but they're really doing them for the first time and doing them with each other and kind of trying to meet each other for the first time. Like there's a lot I think that will be brought into those scenes that expresses itself through unspoken ways. Like Gian, I'm kind of curious. How did you picture those scenes playing out when you were designing like the three beats that you created for this game?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And in some ways, I think this game it's definitely a beginner game in the sense of the mechanics are very easy to grasp, but the role playing I imagine could get very very advanced. And I deliberately left the instructions around the role playing pretty vague. Like some people I've noticed their style when they're at the table with someone else, if they just bare bones describe what's happening, that's actually really meaningful for them. And then some people actually will speak from the voice of their character. They'll say dialogue from the voice of their character. They'll like describe what their character looks like or smells like, or their sensory details as they're going into it. And um, I think when I was creating those beats, like the 3 acts, I really wanted to leave room for people's individual play style because I was considering this from the point of view of people picking up this book might never have played any role playing game, let alone this style or this kind. And so I was trying to write to that. And I think while people might not be as familiar with role playing terms, they are familiar with like theatrical terms, like Act One, Act Two, Act Three. Um, Kind of lofty language and imagery is something that tends to grab people universally, I've noticed. And so I did my best to really incorporate storytelling techniques that, in my experience, work on a very wide range of players or just people who you encounter. Because at my old job, I had to do a lot of oral storytelling, a lot of like entertaining children on the bus when it was broken down, or actually like trying to recruit staff members through storytelling, things like that. And you really have to lean on a huge range of interaction with people. So how do you put that into something static like a block of text, right? And that question, and almost the logistical question of what is the most level I can make this playing field, gave rise to like a lot of the structure, the formatting, the language and imagery that I evoked, the themes even. I think a lot of people find the idea of this epic scale, like, oh, the stakes are this high and our decision is going to affect everything, but also making it very personal and making it, like giving it room for people to be romantic if they want to play it romantically, to play it not romantically if they'd rather lean on the more fraught aspects of arranged marriage. There's just so much room for interpretation, which I think is actually what makes it advanced as well. Because now, with a lot of time passing between writing the game and now, I have noticed the more open ended you make a choice, the harder it can be for some people. So um, the the structure of the game and how like clear it is, I tried to make that as regimented as I did to kind of cut through the open endedness a little bit as well. I hope that answers your question.
No,
It was a very
it
broad
definitely,
answer.
yeah, no, no, that's good. I love the broad answers, and that is something that I feel both games share. I'm actually pulling up Green Hour right now so I can check how the editorial board rated it. Okay, so in this collection, I'll pull this back up here. In this collection, we rated the complexity of each game. And one of the factors that created these ratings was the editorial board of Adams Media, the publisher that published this collection. Um, and so, like, I consider both of your designs like really, really accessible designs. It was, but like the editorial board, I think, actually rated Andale, if I can pull
3 out of 4.
now. Yeah, 3 out of 4. Which
Three Adams Media stars.
well, like that's the thing. Part of their definition of this complexity, I don't think complexity was the right word. It like because they meant in it both complexity and accessibility in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
In that, what the complexity scale was supposed to reflect is if you're flipping through this book, should you play this game if you've on a lark decided to open up the book and tear something out and play, or should you play this game if you have opened the book because you're thinking about next week I might play a game like this. And the complexity scale, I think for Andale is, it's 3 because this is a game that is going to happen over a protracted period of time. You are going to be doing actual correspondence. Where A Green Hour, I think, was rated at a 2 because it was a game that at least the editorial board's like, this has some pretty heady themes, and we're trying to flag that with this. But like, I do. The thing that I love about these games is even if they have complicated themes or require a lot of investment on the part of the players, I think it's still very easy to understand them and understand the style of role playing that's really at the root of what these games are talking about. Like Gian, you had mentioned that this was your first game involving rolling, but and I like see I can see like the your history of design in LARP spaces coming into this. Like a player who their only gaming experience is a trad tabletop game, I think will very quickly be able to connect what they understand of gaming to the more broad personal and story based design that you had done in the past. So I think you did a really great job with that,
Thank you.
with centering that accessibility there. I wanted to talk a little bit about how both of these games are playing with themes of like self and body. Like Jay's game, very much on the forefront, places like, hey, at least one of these characters is trans. Like that is in the rules, which my ADHD will not allow me to avoid this departure. There's the most hilarious thing happened with the editor in Jay's game. Our copy editor went through this book, and he's a wonderful, wonderful copy editor, and he does have experience in game design, but it is mostly he worked with Wizards of the Coast. And a lot of the time, he and I had to explain to the editorial board what certain things in the book meant. Going like the board's like, "This is confusing," and us going, "It's actually not confusing. Let us explain why." But the board was very like keen on trying to understand these things after the first few like hiccups in communication. When they got to reviewing Jay's game, they were like, "Hey, this game mentions dead names, but necromancy doesn't show up again in the design. Is that on purpose?" And I had to explain to them that a dead name is a trans thing and not necromancy. But it's pretty wild that your head went there first.
I wish the moment I heard that from you, I was like, damn, I could have written a slightly different game that would have been very cool. Really, just a couple different words in Annandale by Sea, and I could have had a very interesting, very different game.
There are always room for hacks down the road. That's for sure. But
I am manifesting a letter writing game where one of you you're a lesbian couple and one of you is alive and one of you is dead, and you are writing letters to each other like through some kind of like spectral mailbox system. I am manifesting this. I'm willing it into being. I hope someone else does the actual work of making that and selling it on Itch.
Yeah.
Because I won't, but I hope someone else does.
Yeah, oh boy, I am in love with all of the world building that leads that game to be possible. And anyway, the other obviously trans issues relating to your sense of self and your sense of physical self. And Gian, in your game, like the characters are meeting right before they are expected to transition into a communal form and take on a very different role than like a person would have in the world. I think like the way that both of these are handling those ideas is really interesting. But I'm kind of throwing that out there because it's an obvious connection that the games have, but I don't know that I have a plan for the conversation around it. Other than I suppose like let's move into Andale specifically in this. I can't remember. What was there a timeline given, or is it's up to the player to establish like how long their character has been trans, right?
It actually, so the only instance of mentioning the character as trans is there's two specific spots that I did. Because a lot of the times sometimes when I do trans games like Sleepaway, I'm like very much like, this is a game about being trans. It's like in the DNA, like you can't pull it out. With games like Annandale by Sea or Wanderhome, I kind of like balanced it a little different, where so in Annandale by Sea, the two references to characters sort of thinking about gender is in the thing we mentioned earlier, like with the topics you're not allowed to talk about, um, which like like the ongoing war, Marnie's parents, that time on the beach in the darkness, and Ridley's dead name is one of the four things you're not allowed to talk about. So
Mm-hmm.
it's specified as a thing you're not allowed to talk about, which
Right.
sort of plays with like it kind of plays with it there. And then the other spot is on the list of prompts for like what's been going on. Both of them have a prompt involving going through an event that causes you to realize that your name or something else about yourself might not be suited for what you thought it was. So I kind of wanted a couple spots where like if you know that like I'm thinking about transness and like the little shibboleths, it's like glowing red, but if you don't know exactly what to look for, it can just sort of be part of the web of the game. But it's definitely, I think, like what I was kind of thinking about with transness there is that like I don't know how to tell you your character's relationship with gender. Both the characters use they them pronouns. But what I can give you is like there will come in fact multiple points throughout the game where your character might reconceptualize their relationship with their name. I can tell you that one of your characters has a name different than the one they were given at birth.
Mm-hmm.
I can like give you those little like these characters use they them pronouns. They're in a relationship with each other. Like I can give you these little fragments that you can divulge meaning from, but I don't know what shape those fragments give. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
That's kind of
yeah,
my thinking.
and especially because Ridley's dead name is
Mm-hmm.
highlighted in the world
Mm-hmm.
building section, and Ridley is the
Mm-hmm.
one who left this small community for an urban
Mm-hmm.
lifestyle. Like
Mm-hmm.
that,
Mm-hmm.
it feels like the journey there, especially because the game is about both of these characters developing as people and developing as people apart from each other now. It felt like a lot of the themes of self and identity are intentional and like internally driven, especially because you're
Mm-hmm.
expressing yourself through letter writing. But
Mm-hmm.
Gian, in your game, like I feel like again, it's the other side of this coin because in your game, characters are kind of grappling with the idea of entering into a societally expected identity that they're about to adopt with each other. Um, and like I think it's the one of the interesting facets is both of these characters have lived lives up to this point like outside of this identity, and like they've come to this pivotal point in their life where now everybody around them is going, well, now you're about to become this thing, and we
Yeah,
need you to become this thing. The world ends if you don't become this thing.
yeah. Yeah, I wrote it deliberately to not really go into that much backstory. I like as a tool landing a player or a story in the middle of an action or in the middle of a really big decision. And especially when you only have 2 pages to write, like why
Start
not
in
just
media res. Mm-hmm.
right? Like just go for it. And the um the epic quality of the game isn't necessarily in what is explained. I think it's actually in what's left unsaid. The like I'm looking at the document now, and specifically the structure of the instructions, the gameplay instructions, going over part one is alone together, part two is a new god, and part three is the path before you. Each one of those sections only has like a sentence, but they all um, are both logistical explanations of what it is that you're going to be role playing, but they also touch on the theme of transformation, the fact that the two of you as players are going to be transforming together into either whatever decision you make, um, acceptance or rejection, as well as this new being. Um, and I think that a lot of my games touch on transformation, and it's not something that I do deliberately necessarily. I don't go about writing something with like, this is the motif I'm going to use, because I get an idea and then I pursue it, and then frankly once an idea is done for me I generally don't want to look at it again. It's actually one of my biggest challenges as a designer is I don't like revisiting things. I'm always excited to move on to the next new thing, because I get a lot of ideas, and the one unrenewable resource I have is time, right? So with this game though, looking at it, it's actually kind of cool to see it through your eyes, James, because like there are a lot of themes in it that are very much in keeping with Dear Poppy, which is a one person journaling game where
Mhm.
a loved one transforms into a handful of seeds, and the gameplay
Mhm.
mechanic is actually planting and then growing those seeds in real life. And then
Mhm.
once a week, over the like 7 weeks that it takes for the seeds to germinate and sprout and form their first true leaves, you have to like write this little gratitude journal. It's a way of tricking people into doing a gratitude practice.
Mhm.
And and I really like that because I think it actually gets away or like it creates a veil, a bit of a veil over the innate intimacy of two-player games in general. Because the
Mm.
second you write a two-player game,
Mhm.
it's already intimate. And I know that
Mhm.
for some people, like intimacy is very loaded. And the act of just being in a room with literally just one other person looking at you and relying on you and you providing the story for them and vice versa, like that's a lot. And the stakes can feel high. And so creating themes of transformation, like you're literally playing make believe together. This is the most fundamental way to approach role playing games because
Mhm.
it's all make believe, right? It's what we did as kids. And for me as a kid, often it was with only one or two other friends, and we would be in someone's room or in the woods and just like create this story together, create a narrative
Mhm.
together.
Mhm.
And in a very literal way, that's what the characters in this game are doing. They're coming together to create something wholly new. And I think that there's something about just the act of creation, whether it's a story or what have you, that like takes people a little bit out of their self-consciousness. It's like you have a task before you. You have to do something together. And creating the more kind of fraught personal human themes on top of that, it gives you meat to sink your teeth into if you want to role play it. But if you're self-conscious and shy about it, you can literally just lean on the imagery, like going into the mantles, since each player, so to explain for people who don't have the book, in a green hour each player has a mantle that they bring to their wedding altar, and you roll a 1d6 to see what it is, and it's everything from um, if you roll a 2 you get sea's embrace, so your mantle is flooding your bower with a warm tide glowing with bioluminescence, to let's say you roll a um, 4, which is singing season, weave together the fox's crying riotous birdsong, the wolves' keening chorus, and an improbable perfect harmony. So all of it is very sensory, all of it is very evocative, and you can literally just write down that sentence, and that page becomes an artifact, right? That loose piece of paper that you're playing with your friend, like suddenly it's a story. And I think like um, giving people scaffolding to feel shy but still go for it, that's like really important in any two-player game because it's always
Mhm.
going to be intimate. It doesn't matter what
Mhm.
the story is, the feeling is going to be intimate.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Gian, I love the way that that is expressed. And also, before we dive deeper into that, I wanted to say I absolutely loved the mantles. I loved everything that you wrote for them. I think they were, because we did a lot of iteration with your design, and those were the things that I think stuck beginning to end because they were so evocative and so buck wild. As soon as I saw that, I was like, oh my God, this game is gonna rule. I wanted to talk about
Can
the.
I quickly say real
Oh yeah.
quick first though that I've never gotten to work on an RPG like with an editor who's like directing the RPG into the big way. You know, like I've had like line editors and copy editors, but I never worked with someone who like is like, I think you need to go back to the drawing board, and that was just such a delight. Thank you. Like it's so, I don't know. There's something really emotionally satisfying about like sending in my first draft of this, and I think because I originally I sent in a much more like setting agnostic thing of just like rules for playing a letter writing game, and you were like, no, 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 be specific, and I was like, you're right. I should be being specific right now, and like that was, I don't know, really. I was just really appreciative of that particular bit of editorial direction in terms of like thinking about how to make the game good. That's all. Sorry.
Oh, I mean, well, that's one of the wonderful things that comes from actually doing a book like this in a traditional sort of publishing sense. I wish that we had Sharong with us right now because
Mhm.
Sharong did the Honey and Hot Wax anthology, and I'm
Mhm.
so curious to see if the editorial process for that was at all similar to the editorial process for this, uh, just in the sense of because this was done in a very traditional way. Like I was kind of expecting my role as editor really to be mostly in recruitment because I was going out. We weren't doing an open call for anything. Everybody that I
Mhm.
was dealing with had some sort of experience, whether I knew them as a designer or not. Like I knew that they were out there in the space and I knew how to find them. So I figured I'm just out here to recruit people. And the publisher was like, "Oh no, you gotta talk to these people and like help them with their designs." And I'm like, a lot of these people are more experienced than me. So that's a wild notion. Um, but like they were like you need to represent our publisher's perspective, which is we're trying to make this book for people who have never played role playing games before. So there are going to be times where we need somebody who can actually like help someone think about the language of accessibility and whatnot in terms of how they put these games together. And like because there was a big publisher like behind this and because they have had structures for anthologies before, like I think we actually got to do that. I think this sort of back and forth editorial like practice, I don't know how common it is for games, at least in the circles that I'm familiar with in publishing. Like I don't see a lot
Mhm.
of it. But Jay, you are a publisher,
Mhm.
and you're a
Yeah.
publisher who works with people. Is
Mhm.
that kind of what you do?
Yeah. So I've never. It's a. We're still Possible Creative Games is still figuring out like publishing other people. It's the big step we're moving towards right now in 2021. We have a couple conversations with people. We're kind of pushing into a couple areas, but like the sort of the big interesting thing that comes out of it is realizing like the tension between the like I don't know, like trying to find that like the spot between 1,000 different conflicting forces, I think is one of the most interesting things. And I think overwhelmingly when we talk about indie designers, we're thinking about people who are like one person workshops, like they are, one person kind of like who is sort of the genesis and release of this vision. And like anyone they bring in is to like augment the vision. Like the way people historically conceptualize, like what does it mean to hire an editor in RPGs means hiring someone to edit or consult on your work.
Hmm.
But like one of the big things I'm coming back to, for example, with an upcoming game that I've been working on, Yazeva's Bed and Breakfast, is a game that has specific characters, and I know some number of those characters are going to be people of color. And I think under a traditional model of like being the sole genesis to release sort of structure would mean that I like bringing in a consultant to advise on, I don't know, a consultant wouldn't be the correct relationship for ensuring that a character actually reflects this experience instead of just like me getting advice on that reflection. And so like one of the big interesting parts of being like, oh cool, I'm not just a writer, I'm a publisher who has happened to be the one writing this thing, is that I get to think about it with that toolkit and be like, all right, how do I like, how do I bring in like what does it mean to, instead of being like I'm bringing in a consultant, be like I'm bringing in a writer, like that kind of like, and like that's I think like a mindset that publishers, like someone who's thinking about publishing without having to worry about being the like only pipeline, is a really interesting spot to be in. That's a total digression from the stuff we're talking about. It's just been on my mind a lot.
Yeah, no, it
Mm-hmm.
is it is so interesting because like I definitely had a different perspective than I would have expected to have coming from RPG publishing. A lot of the time,
Mm-hmm.
I felt like I'm here to protect the idea and the heart at the core of each of these games, um, and I kind of have to protect that from the idea of accessibility. I don't want to say
Mm-hmm.
that accessibility is not a positive thing, or that the editorial board was somehow like aggressively trying to ruin games that were going into this collection. But there were definitely things that the editorial board wanted that I knew, like, if we were to give it to them, it would be to the detriment of the heart of some of these designs. Like, I think
Mm-hmm.
originally they wanted to cut the prompts that Jay had included in,
Mm-hmm,
in Jay's
mm-hmm.
game,
Yeah, yeah.
like a lot.
They wanted to cut my. Yeah, they were like, can you make it odds or even playing cards? And I was like,
Yeah.
must I?
Yeah, yeah, it was so like a lot of that is me lobbying like, okay, how do we take the heart here and not, you know, not let the editorial board and the things that they are afraid of, ruin the game. Like Gion's game too, sex is kind of a core theme that I think was more at the forefront in the first couple iterations of the game.
Yeah, I think I literally used the word consummation, and you were like, I think they might want it.
Yeah.
That's fair. Well, and it's also like I get it. I don't have firsthand experience, but I have a lot of observations from friends who are published authors in various like literary circles. Editors have a key role in kind of like translating between publisher and writer or publisher and creator, right? And I think that games is actually somewhat new to the mainstream publishing market in general, but also just that process and that style of iteration, and especially niche indie games like this, because often they are one person talking maybe to their friends to workshop stuff, but I remember this from literature classes I took too. Like when I studied Raymond Carver, we were talking a lot about new correspondence that actually revealed a lot of what is known to be Raymond Carver's style, right? Like clipped short sentences, extremely brief, so much that's left unsaid but just shown. That was actually a lot of it was his editor. And if you look at early drafts of his work, they're quite
Yeah.
different. And so, to what degree does an editor actually come in and create as well? And there has to be a little bit of it. And that was my experience with you. And it was immensely helpful because, as I
Mm-hmm,
said, it
mm-hmm.
was my first dice game. And I didn't know how dice mechanics worked until we iterated the third or fourth time. That was when it really sank in. And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, and your patience and comprehension in both like
Mm-hmm.
in receiving information from my process, but also then like spitting it back out, not just to me, but also to the publishers. Like that's so essential in creating an anthology of this style, which is still quite new for games, in my understanding. It might
Mm-hmm.
be, is it the first one of its kind?
This is certainly the first one that's put out by like a traditional book
Yeah.
publisher. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
friggin' Simon and Schuster, currently in talks to get acquired by
Yeah.
Penguin Random House. So like, this is at the time one of the two largest book publishers in the world. They certainly have not done role-playing games before.
Mm-hmm.
They have
Yeah.
they've absolutely done anthologies and poetry anthologies, literature
Mm-hmm.
anthologies,
Mm-hmm.
but this is their first time doing this sort of thing.
Yeah.
So we're breaking a lot of ground in terms of trying to figure out the process on this. And
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
there were so many perspectives flying back and forth on this because not only do we have the designers creating the ideas and presenting those ideas, me receiving them, being like, okay, because my eye in this was like, what is the most important thing? If they ask for changes, what needs to be protected, and how do we protect that in an appropriate way to go after and chase down like what ideas of accessibility the editorial board wanted. I then had my copy editor who was, concerned with the language and understood games, but still, would go to certain points that's like, ooh, I think this needs to change. And I'd go, okay, does changing this change something larger? And then
Right.
the copy editor was the direct, like a direct contact. Both of us were in contact with the board, but I have my
Yeah.
managing editor above me who talks directly to the board and presents the things that myself and
Mm-hmm.
the copy editor like do to the game to the board. The board then discusses that, brings that to my managing editor back to me. So like we're
Oh
juggling
my goodness.
so many
Mm-hmm.
different things,
Yeah.
and everybody has a different agenda, but all of those
Exactly.
agendas I think are important.
And the
Yeah,
thing is,
yeah.
like, this gets back to what you were talking about with accessibility, because in
Mm-hmm.
games, often when we talk about accessibility, we're talking about essentially disability rights and trying to create better options for one way or another disabled players, neurodivergent players, what have you. But from this aspect, like with all of these not competing but differing agendas, Another axis that enters into the graph is comprehension, just basic
Mm-hmm.
comprehension on the part of people who have never played not just the style of role-playing game before, maybe, but again, like
Mm-hmm.
never played a game like
Mm-hmm.
this at all. Not D&D, not Pathfinder, not nothing. And
Mm-hmm.
so that is actually also in some ways, I don't know if accessibility is the exact word, because I really want to keep words meaning what they are meant to mean, but
Marketability. We can.
marketability,
Yeah.
or a term that I've heard before in other work I've done is barrier to entry, right? Like, how
Yes.
high are you
Yeah.
making the barrier to entry
Mm-hmm.
for certain kinds of people who may or
Yeah.
may not pick up this book off the shelf? If
Mm-hmm.
this was faced open, I used to be a bookseller, like just
Mm-hmm.
retail, right? And so, like, if this was faced open, how would I hand sell this book to like
Mm-hmm.
multiple kinds of customers? And that's something
Mm-hmm.
that you'd really have to think about
Yeah.
as an editor.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And one thing I've been with that, I don't know. This is I've been working on Wanderhome for a bit. It's my first Kickstarter of that scale, and one of the things about it is like, I originally Kickstarted expecting to kind of have the same, like, the barrier of entry I'd be talking about would be the audience that I was used to having, like in terms of
Mhm.
like people who are kind of already aware of what's going on, interested in it because maybe they know me, maybe they know like designs like it. And then I, did the Kickstarter. I got a bunch of attention from people who, like sort of a bunch of attention from people who, sort of engage with RPGs in different ways. And I think something only like 40% of my backers have ever played an RPG outside of Dungeons and Dragons, and
Wow.
like yeah, like another, and then 30% have only, and then like 30% have never played an RPG at all, or like have like maybe listened to a little bit of a podcast, like maybe they're like Critical Role fans or something. And so like suddenly I'm like part of the work on Wanderhome has been like, oh, not only am I getting this draft to completion, I must now go back and think of it as I must radically adjust sort of who I was thinking of, how they were picking up this book, and sort of reframe a ton of the earlier stuff to make sure that the book is kind of a gentle glide in. And so like definitely like thinking about the conversations we had and also reading this book has been like actually valuable for me on that front, thinking about like, well, what did your board think needed to be said about RPGs to get someone into the space? Because there's a lot of debates on Twitter, and sometimes I see people where they're like, you don't have to explain what an RPG is at all. It's 2020. You can just Google it. And it's like, well, I don't know. Like, I found that's not true.
Yes. So, I mean, one of the cruelest things that this publisher asked me to do was write the definition of role-playing game.
That
And
monster.
GMs and PCs, and that it goes back, I think, to my first book. They wanted that, and I revised it heavily in my second book, and I've pretty much kept the definition since then, going into this and my fourth book, which is upcoming. Um, but like I'm very much of the perspective of a lot of the ways it feels like when we're writing that introduction section for role-playing games, it feels so apologetic. It feels so hand-wringing and like I'm going to take you back to basics. And like when you are playing a board game, absolutely nobody stops and explain, in the world of board gaming, you move pieces of cardboard around and it represents an abstract concept. Like, we don't have to do that. So I am definitely one of those sticks in the mud who's like, no, we shouldn't have to do that. But a lot of the time when I'm thinking about that, like I am thinking of games that I don't think are chasing after an audience that is open and outward facing, where this is. And like I think because of the happenstance of Wanderhome, like Wanderhome absolutely is. And who knows if this is a big success? Maybe indie designers should really be thinking of that outward-facing kind of language in
Yeah.
everything that they're doing anyway. Like,
I think they should be thinking about that regardless of the success of this book, which I have no doubt will be excellent. And I think that no matter what, if you want to talk about barriers to entry, clarity is one of the highest ones, right? And like one of the things I love about your introduction to this book, James, is how clear everything is. That apologetic tone that people sometimes take up, not in games specifically, just in general when they're trying to explain the background that you need to know for a process, like that is not necessary. And if you've ever tried to teach a 4, 5, 6-year-old how to do something that involves more than 2 steps, it is not helpful to say like, I'm sorry, this is kind of weird or hard. Like, no, you're just like, this is gonna be awesome, and this is
Mm-hmm.
why. This is step 1, step 2, step 3. Now we're gonna do it. And like, if it's
Mm-hmm.
longer than that, you lost them. And
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
if you are writing to an open-faced audience, you kind of have to, in my view, like, imagine that you're explaining it to someone who has no background with it, like, and it's totally new to
Mm-hmm.
them, the same way that like stuff that's familiar to us would be totally new to a child.
Mm-hmm.
And I think like clarity is always good, succinctness is always good,
Mm-hmm.
and you really nailed it with the intro in this book. It's so good.
I,
Mm-hmm.
I I mean, thank you so much. I worked hard on that and I stressed out about it so much, especially because I bitterly didn't want to have to do it, but you do. I mean, I think of like Grant Howitt is one of the designers in this book, who y'all probably know from Honey Heist. And one of the things that impresses me about Honey Heist is it is this wildly accessible game that has been the first contact role playing game for a not insignificant number of people. And the way it explains role playing games is it goes, you are bears and you have a complex plan and not much time and you're going to HoneyCon. Like, I didn't even, I was
Mm-hmm.
paraphrasing. Grant writes it clearer, but like
Mm-hmm.
somebody can pick up that sheet and they might need somebody who's played a role-playing game before at the
Mm-hmm.
table, but like they can kind of get it, go, oh, I am the bear, great, I'm thinking from a bear's perspective, I'm
Mm-hmm.
using a bear's
Mm-hmm.
tools, like that's role-playing. I didn't need a
Mm-hmm.
whole, the GM is this magical person who controls the world, all of this, like so I really like outward
Mm-hmm.
facing, like I'm still up and down about it. Like I
Mm-hmm.
don't think lyric games, for instance, that
Mm-hmm.
hit itch, I don't think they benefit from that. I don't think they're chasing after that.
I would love a lyric game that's like, in the magical world of lyric games, I'm giving you a piece of paper and I don't know what to do with it, and neither do you. It's been an interesting thing with that, specifically with Wanderhome, just because again, I feel that's my mind's been we are just finishing up the last rounds of edits right now, and so like my brain is just flooded with it right now. But one of the big things in it is that it's got a very unique writing style. Like the voice is very specific, and like the voice has been one that like me and Kazumi have been like brainstorming just to like get the voice right. And when trying to explain those such things like what is a role playing game, it's like you don't want to like break character to explain it, right? Like you don't want to be like,
Mm.
I'm like, and this is Wander Home. This is a role playing game, right? You don't want to like have to like shift voice to articulate it. So like but the fun part is that by realizing that I can't shift voice and I must just explain it like in the Wander Home voice, my explanation becomes like a couple sentences because it really is the feeling of like, all right, well, how would an old mouse explain to you what an RPG is if you're like sitting down at the table with her and she's just like, you're gonna take this book and you're gonna use it to tell a story with your friends. There you go. Like we're good. We can move on now.
Throw
There's
every
also
rule of writing out the window. From now on, the only rule is how would an old mouse say this?
that's right. That's right.
100 rules of writing. That's just lists of different animals that could be writing books.
I'm sorry. I have to control my face. I'm sorry. Bartleby's off screen and he's doing something so cute. My cat is so cute. I'm sorry.
I am
Okay.
visualizing. I am imagining.
What? Sorry.
How would an old one-eyed cat write an RPG?
How would my cat write the RPG? Yeah, I think like trusting your reader to be smart
Mm-hmm.
and understand what you're saying while also knowing what is essential to them being smart is
Mm-hmm.
really tricky. And
Mm-hmm.
a book that has a good intro like that, it's worth its weight in gold, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
this
Mm-hmm.
book for that intro alone, and then you get all of these games where you can like test it out, right? And it
Mm-hmm.
reminds me of conversations I've had about films, right? Like one of my favorite, it's the only Christopher Nolan movie I really, really like. And it's called The Prestige. And it's this
Mm.
very complicated movie about magicians. Um, and it's so multi-layered. And multiple people who I've watched it with was like, I just wish they did more like exposition or explaining. And it's not that exposition's bad, but the movie doesn't actually need it. And what I loved about it is it's like this movie is just unapologetically fucking extra, and it's not going to explain that much at all, and it's going to expect you to keep up. And I think that having that attitude rather than the apology attitude can be very helpful as well. Of like, you're smart and I know you're going to get it. This is what I need you to get. Okay, now let's go. And like, that's all.
You can always tell in like sci-fi movies when the creator, when the editor and the people in charge of the sci-fi movie is like insecure about the concept of it. Like, I always come back to how Star Wars opens.
Yes.
Star Wars has such a good opening, like for getting you like. I rewatched Star Wars a few years ago with some friends, and I played a game with myself where I pretended that it was 1976 and I didn't know a single goddamn thing. I hadn't seen any trailers. I just like walked into the movie theater and like caught this movie, and it rules. Like, it was such a it was really this feeling of like, you sit down and it's like Star Wars, and then it like tells you some like important Star Wars facts, and then it shows you a big spaceship, and like you're there. Like, it's not afraid to be like what it is. It's not like I feel I feel like sometimes, like, I love Jupiter Ascending. It's one of my favorite movies. You can tell the editors are insecure about what the Wachowskis made, because like it's got that like the opening of it is so like, I'm going to do a voiceover while I talk about my parents, and I kind of like lead everything in very gently because I don't want you to be surprised by the weird things. Whereas like you can kind of feel that, you know, like you didn't have to go that way. You know, like it was not maybe how the Wachowski sisters wanted it to go.
That is a fascinating like deconstruction of that dynamic there, because I kind of think the crawl in Star Wars is a direct manifestation of George Lucas's insecurity, in that George Lucas is like, oh, you need to know all of this important political bullshit to understand what you're about to see, and like. I don't think it does the thing that George wanted it to do in that moment, which is provide the audience a lot of stuff. I think the crawl could have simply said, hey, there's more to what is going on here than what you immediately see right now. Like, that's all it really says.
This story is en media res. I think the thing with the crawl, I feel like one thing I always come back to when I think a lot about that time I rewatched Star Wars, and the fact that like the crawl, like, it uses a lot of words it doesn't explain and then do not directly come up in the plot in a way that feels very like
it's like lived in.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's throwing around terms that like George Lucas, I think, assumed that you knew what those terms were because George Lucas like kind of just had a very weird relationship to like what he thought people connected to. But like I think that for me, like I really like I always really delight in like I would when I was a very little kid, I would get the 4th edition monster manuals, and I wouldn't understand how like the numbers worked in D&D at all. Like I didn't care. And this is 4th edition, which I cared a lot about the numbers, but I didn't need that. I just needed the pictures of the monsters and like the flavor, and it would reference these like hells and other worlds and like societies and like Dragonlances or whatever, and I'd be like, I don't know what any of this is. I do not care. The joy for me is not in learning about these new things. It is about getting little peepholes into a world that I don't get to be in. Like, I get to knock my hand on the glass, but I don't get to actually like be in there.
You know, I find this so. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to talk.
I was just tying back to your game. You go for it.
Oh yeah. I mean, finish your thought and then.
Oh, I was gonna say, I'm like with the Green Hour. It feels similarly because I feel like there's things you say in there that feel so like that have that similar moment for me where it's like the way in which you talk about. I think it's specifically like the way in which you talk about the mantle feels so exciting to me because it feels almost like I don't necessarily 100% know exactly what the mantle is or its significance to the community, but the text gives it so much significance, and it gives me so much there to like start fitting the mantle into my mind that like it's better than if you'd like it's like 1,000 times better than if you'd included a little drawing of like what you imagine like a mantle looking like. You know what I mean? Like the fact that there's like this little absence there is really delightful.
I was gonna say I love that. This aside about Star Wars is actually bringing me back to something that I considered in your game as well, which is Annandale by Sea. By virtue of being epistolary, I have been working on a bunch of epistolary games, but I haven't finished any. And also, it wasn't until this past week that I started writing letters from the point of view of characters in a game, and it's actually I have a Kickstarter coming up on it's launching on the 15th called Field Guide to Memory, and I and my friend Shingyan Kaur, who's an amazing comic artist and writer, are co-designing a game where you as the player, you are the main character, but everything you're doing is to initially try to carry on the legacy of your mentor, and your mentor is this fleshed out character. She has a name. Her name is Dr. Elizabeth Lee. She has like a whole timeline, and we have details about her life. But you, as a player, don't get to see the overview of everything. You only get little first person correspondences from the institution she worked for, from old lovers, from kids who looked up to her and then became scientists because of her. And I have been writing sample letters because part of the Kickstarter is to create ephemera that we're going to scan in, and it's going to be part of the game. Every day you get emailed like this new letter and then a text version of it for alt reads, and then you do a prompt. And the act of writing a letter from the point of view of a character in a game or as part of a story was so immediately, and I know this is a loaded word, but I'm going to use it, immersive, right? I immediately I wrote this very romantic, like maybe more romantic than I am generally inclined to be in my real life, letter from the point of view of an old lover of this character. And I didn't plan it out ahead. I literally made coffee, and then in 5 or 10 minutes I wrote maybe the most beautiful letter I've ever written in my life. And it it was amazing how quickly I could actually get sensory details. There's a passage where she describes prying urchins off of rocks to eat the uni, and I could imagine the sound of the surf and the feeling of the sun at low tide. And in Annandale by the Sea, what's remarkable to me is your characters to some degree are pre-written. There are certain aspects of their life, their identity, their past, together as well as individually, that are just set in stone. And yet through writing these letters from their point of view, you're putting you're putting the players into this remarkable wormhole where you just go right into first person feelings and first person experiences and first person correspondence. That act of it being a 2-person game where the communication is asynchronous, and you don't even know lately with the US postal system if it's going to get there at all. And USPS is great, and you still don't know. And and I just love that. Actually, I love that it's not actually about the recipient or the act of receiving it. It's the act of writing it and giving it, and that's character creation. That's experience creation. I love your game because the experience you create is wholly internal, and yet it's still an incredibly rich, imaginative game. You're role playing, and I think solo games, 2-player games like that, are so remarkable. Is why I'm fascinated with them. They're like the opposite of lonely, right? You're starting to think of yourself as this hermetic unit, but like an enclosed biosphere terrarium where there's so much life within it, and you get to explore it in different ways.
That's such a good way to put it. I've been thinking about that a lot with your anthology Solitary, I'm sorry, Solitaire or Solitary? Is it?
It's Solitaire,
It's Solitaire. Okay, yeah, I thought so, and then I was like, wait, is it? And then yeah. I love that's the thing I was thinking about with Solitaire, and I think about with a lot of your solo games, because I don't write. I don't think I've ever actually. I've written a couple hacks of games that are solo games that were not really written. It's not really the way I think about playing, and the only time where a solo game has ever really felt very strongly for me, outside of 1,000-Year-Old Vampire, which I think is one of my favorites. Your games have been really influential for me. So good. But just in terms of I think 1,000-Year-Old Vampire is a good example, but I think your games are an even better example of that biosphere sensation of that this is a game that is happening because there's that old kind of bit of game design theory about how you can't be the person who instigates, performs, and resolves the same action or something like that. I don't know. I haven't done the assigned reading. That but like that's that old theory, and like it was kind of like used as an argument like 4 years ago about like why you can't do solo games. And I think what your games really efficiently prove is that the problem there is that if you think of yourself as a lonely unit, then like yeah, you can't carry through and finish the same action. Like you'll feel lonely. Like it's not so much that like it can't happen, but just you'll feel lonely. And I feel like what your games do is that they're not lonely, right? Like it is the mechanism occurring within itself, within like your like within like a terrarium that is you, you know. Like
I went on a whole emotional journey digesting that piece of game design theory because like immediately I rejected it, and then I considered the structure of what it meant. I was like, okay, and after that I rejected it even harder.
I've literally, what's fascinating is I've never formally studied game design theory, so this is the first I'm hearing of it, and my immediate thought internally, which wasn't in response to you as my friends, just that theory was like, that's kind of silly, and like that's all I thought, because like I can see what they mean by it, right? Like for something that is, well, even a board game, like think about the card game Solitaire, right? Like if you're playing Solitaire, you're literally doing all of those things. It's an incredibly fulfilling game. I love Solitaire.
I guess I think the argument to play I don't know, the Forge's advocate. I guess the idea is that in Solitaire,
that's why I don't like the advice.
I know. We're spitting hot takes at 7:12 p.m. in the
21 people getting those hot takes, baby.
Is that like the deck is the agent that keeps it from being entirely lonely? You know, it's like the deck is random and like the placement of the cards is random, and so there's like an element of uncertainty occurring. Which I guess is the idea. But also, like, I don't know, I still feel like a solo game doesn't require that uncertainty, right? Like, you have to do it internally.
I think it I mean, for me, like, that's what game design is, and it is creating the structure for play. Like, yeah, sure, if you're told, like, make something up, like, yes, then you're not working with another agent. Like, that isn't anything. But if you create the structure of, like, think this way and then think this way, even if you're alone, that is enough of a structure for the game to exist. So I'm sure I could get into hours and hours of arguments on an online forum about that.
Oh god, I'm sure. Yeah, I can absolutely picture a version of myself in 2014 getting very passionate about this.
James, out of curiosity, are there any solo games in the Ultimate Micro RPG?
Yes, there are. Bo Sheldon has Lichen Tree, which is about creating a family tree for werewolves. That game can be solo or group play, and there is another one. I think it's Kenna Shaw's.
Oh, yes, it is. Yes, okay. With sword and heavy in hand. That's
it. There were so many games with sword in the title. That's why I was having trouble recalling.
That's how you know it's the good stuff.
Sword games! I'm pulling it up right now as we speak.
Yeah.
It has gorgeous graphic design, as they all do.
Oh, yeah. This one is beautiful. Ooh. I am going to pull it up so the audience can see with us. And also, an interesting note here, we landed on complexity 1 for this game.
I was going to say, spicy.
Yeah, which this is I
guess because you literally, like, one of us could play it right now in this moment.
Is that the idea, that it's, like, very low barrier to entry for a player?
So I was trying to investigate that while we were talking, because I took a tour of the other 2-player games in this book. Or at least the other 2-player games that I remembered were 2-player immediately off the top of my head, which were Doomed Stars by Adira Slattery and Swords by Starlight by Anna Anthropy. And Doomed Stars came in at a 2 for complexity. But that game, I really think, isn't all that complex. Like, you play 2 stars that are in love with each other and are therefore going to crash into each other, and you like slide pieces of paper slowly off the table across the table, and when they meet you crumple them together and make explosion noises, which to me felt very like, that's easy. like that should be low barrier to entry, low complexity. But it came in at a 2, and I can't remember if that's because it had like kinetic aspects and like, oh, if somebody has physical limitations, this might be a difficulty. Like you do need to be in a place with a table for this to work. Where Swords by Starlight, which
One.
yeah, got a 1, which that game has a lot of mechanical like crunch to it that I don't think Doomed Stars has. But the thing that was going for Swords by Starlight is it feels closer to the structure of a traditional game. Or a traditional RPG. Like if you're coming from D&D, Swords by Starlight is kind of a scene by scene. These are two like people who are in love with each other, but they're also rivals on opposite sides of a conflict. And part of what you're doing is rolling dice to see who wins. So I think the board in that case are like, oh, this is like D&D, so people are going to be able to understand this really easily. And
Yeah,
that
I think
might
there's also. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, that might be what was going into with Sword Heavy in Hand.
Yeah, I just read with Sword Heavy in Hand as we were just skimmed it as we were talking, and like I'm gonna play it. Kiana wrote something really remarkable there. And I
Yeah, I had
can
the same reaction. Yeah.
yeah, I can see why it's a 1-star, both in terms of like you don't need anything you probably don't already have in your house, but also the way that it's written, there is a certain amount of open-endedness, which is sometimes challenging, but there's dice rolling to see what prompts you're going to get, which dice tables as storytelling device are very useful for choice paralysis. And so I can see why like that game earned 1, because it actually is pretty low barrier to entry. I'm going to see if it might be something that would be a good creative writing exercise for some of my old students.
I also think that it's really useful because it feels like very much a solo game that's like distilled down to like its most solo-y-ness. Like it really is like, here is a game, like you are answering some questions about yourself. The text is asking you to contemplate things a bit. You come to a conclusion. Like it is a little, it kind of does that same little meditative journey in a very like dependable way, and you're left with something after it. It's a good game.
It's a great game.
Yeah.
I really want to talk to them about it now, actually, because this is, I think, the only game in the collection that was designed before the collection. Like when I brought the offer to her, she was like, "I've got this game. Can I use a game that already exists?" Oh wait, that's not true. That's not true, because what our bodies tell us at least had been play tested before.
Got it.
I've
been looking through. It's a 40 games is a lot to read in detail. And one of the challenges for me in, kind of going back to my roots in hand selling books is like trying to think about what game would grab someone random talking to me and like gaining familiarity with all of them. But like I also have been like, what 3 games would I recommend to start with? And I think Kiana's is actually gonna be one of them, because it's low barrier to entry, because it's unusual in the way a lot of these styles of games are unusual, and because the story it tells is immediately very evocative. So kudos, Kiana, like really well designed.
And the thing that I'm curious about, I as far as I can recall, and details are hazy because I was working so hard at the time, I think Kiana's game was one of the few that had no notes, like from the editorial board. And I don't know if that's because I was like, oh yeah, you can use a pre-existing game. And Kiana then sat down and was like, okay, how do I refine this? Because like, in reality, it just, this meant that Kiana had a lot more time to like revise and look at things and go, how am I presenting myself and my ideas than everybody else, because everybody else was starting from scratch. I'd also want to ask Ara the same questions. Because like that game, I remember the Metatopia that game was being playtested. That was like a couple years ago. I actually don't know if it existed in a published form, but I absolutely admire like the gall to present that game to this publishing board, the game where you draw on people's bodies, because like, oh man, were they concerned? Yes. And I expected to have a bigger fight about that one, but they just let that one in. So.
That's awesome. I love that mechanic so much. A lot of Aura's work is very tangible and visceral in that way, and I love it. This game,
Mm-hmm.
that's definitely a game. I don't know if it's like entry level random person wandering into a bookstore recommendation, like, but I like a lot of my friends who have never played role playing games before and like are trying to wrap their heads around like the vast expanse of what even the term role playing game can mean. I would be like, you don't have to play it, but read Aura's game and just think, like, imagine through playing it and think about what that would feel like. I think like that's a great recommendation.
Yeah.
Jason's
Oh,
game
man.
also, because it's like so different and it's very like it's just so technically perfect, and the story it tells is fucking brutal and sad, and it's a completely different kind of story too, and I think like um it's very cool to have in the collection. It's so brutal. It's
It
so
it
dark.
it it
Oh
is.
god, which
And
one's Jason's again? I'm
Jason's
sorry.
is Object
Object
Kilo.
Kilo. It's
Uh,
so good.
it Oh
And
boy, yeah, this game absolutely rules, especially like
yes.
if you're millennial or Gen Z in the working world, I think it will connect on a lot of levels.
I played this game once, and it is really rough, but also it's a great story. Yeah, it's really
Yeah,
good,
I'm reading it right now.
isn't it? Oh, it's so dark. Anyway,
I
Oh
had to
god.
like there was a very important part of this game that I don't want to necessarily dive too much into
yeah.
because it might spoil things. But
Hmm.
the way you end the game is a thing that I had to fight for because it is a thing that it leaves a lot in the hands of the audience playing it. And this is, I guess, another interesting thing where, like, the editorial board thought if we don't directly spell out everything you're supposed to do, then an audience isn't going to be able to pick it up. And I think a very important part of this game does not identify how specifically it's supposed to end. It leaves that really in the hands of the players. And like we kind of butted heads a little bit over it just because I'm like, no, it's so important that it doesn't define that. That's part of why it works. And the board's like, well, you need to be able to end the game. And I'm like, well, people aren't going to get trapped. This isn't Jumanji. They're not going to get. I can't
This
stop
isn't
playing
Kieran
this
Gillen's
game.
game.
I'm still
I
playing
always
Object
think it's
Kilo.
so funny. I do kind of feel like every single game secretly includes the text play until it's not fun anymore. Uh, although what's I think okay, this is such a complete diversion, and I'm sorry for being I'm not apologizing for being ADHD. I am ADHD, and thus this diversion is happening to all of us against our will. But there's the like I think a lot about the maxim in running games for kids of like you want to call the game at like max fun. You don't when you're running a game for kids, you want to stop the game like right as the kids are having the most fun, like right before it starts to wane, because you don't want their last memory to be like a sour taste in their mouth. You want to like call it at the like they are having fun, like their memory is having fun. And so the instruction is like I think a lot of games with endpoints are secretly designed so that that is where the endpoint is. Like if the climax of the game is that maximum tension, and then the release is like, you know, like that's when the game ends, then like yeah, it is kind of designed for it. But I think there's an interesting little moment in Play Until You Stop Having Fun, in that you don't realize you've stopped having fun until you've not been having fun for just a little bit. And so it gives that like little bit of like, okay, this game will end on like this game will not end at like when you are the most invested in it, and that's a good thing for the themes of the game, for the structure of the game. It ends like when you realize that it's like, oh, okay, you know, when you get the little bit of Jumanji in your head, and then you're like, no, we're good, we can stop this. I just think it's
Yeah,
good design.
at my old job, yeah, we talked about that a lot. We called it peak fun. It was a work policy.
Yeah,
And I think it's interesting because often monitoring that and creating that experience for me in my limited like subjective experience of the world is way easier with a facilitator, with a GM. Um, and a lot of the games in this book are GM-less or two-player, or you know, and so I think it's an interesting question of how do you frame these games when you recommend them to encourage people to end at peak fun for themselves, for their co-player, for everyone at the table if it is GMless, because that is like a major structural challenge in most GMless games, is like, how do you collectively make a decision? And that is something that games that explicitly have a facilitator or GM don't have to grapple with as much. It's like, it's in their hands. They get to call a scene, often collaboratively, like with buy-in from other players. But like, I know when I've run games and games that require an MC or a GM or whatever, it's like, it's when the action or the scene or whatever seems like the highest octane, that's when I call it, because it leaves people, it leaves you with the momentum to calendar the next session, which is always the challenge in ongoing games.
And
So.
Jay, I think this really relates very heavily to your work when I think about Sleepaway and Wander Home and kind of the structural difference between them. In Sleepaway, you know, you do have this very structured sort of setup about how different events can flow and how a game ends, where Wander Home really doesn't have that, or at least the session that I played didn't. I don't know if the larger game is different.
That's common. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Wander Home is. I think both of my games. I don't know. A lot of my games are very invested in like I think a lot about that question of peak fun and like what does it mean to like articulate that. I think Wander Home's solution is just fundamentally different than Sleepaway's solution, which is that like with Sleepaway, I think it's kind of taking on a more conventional approach to that, where it's like there are 3 acts, end sort of building towards the next act, or for the final one, it like concludes things cleanly and a little abstractly. Like, it kind of like moves the pieces that way. Wander Home, I think I just somewhere along the line just don't think of what it means to have fun in a long-term game of Wander Home the same way people think about having fun in other long-term games. Like the comparison I always keep coming back to is like that a long-term game of Wander Home, like one that you're playing over years and years, is much more meditative and much more like reflective. And like it does, like it's sort of like you are slowly building out this world and like developing things and kind of going places, but it's very it's intentionally not about generating those kind of like excitement spikes and plateaus and drops that a lot of like traditional stories are about making. And so like I've got people, there's a group of people who aren't even playtesters, they're just folks who grabbed the play kit and they've been playing once a week since July. And I'm like, damn, I don't even have the rules for long-term play in there, and y'all are going off. They're like, we just hit Candle Feast, and I'm like, damn, I gave you a calendar in that play kit, like on a lark, and you are making your way through it. Whereas like I think long-term play for Wander Home, I think my goal is like the feeling of like, I always want a game to feel like by the end of it, like that you've learned the game well enough that you could like. You can create the game, not just like teach it to others, but also like my ideal like is if you've played Wander Home for long enough time, you've been given all the tools you need to make more Wander Home. Like if it was you who was in charge of writing, I don't know, Wander Home 2 or whatever, like you have the toolkit now once you've played it for long enough. And I feel like that's just a different relationship to peak fun than I think like when talking about a shorter game. Because there's kind of the question of what does it mean to get that level in there?
Yeah. Oh man, that is absolutely fascinating.
I want to do a really quick time check because it's 4:30, and I noticed it because the lighting on my face has changed because the sun is setting.
I noticed that, yeah.
So I just want to know.
Actually, yeah,
how are you doing?
we were planning this for an hour and a half. We are now at an hour and 28 minutes. So we are basically hitting that note perfect, hitting that peak fun. I did want to add on the note of peak fun that as a former child, it's not at all shocking to me to discover that part of the structural philosophy of the adults around me was to rip me away from the things that I was doing just as I was having the most fun. That is how it felt, and it makes sense that that's how it was.
Well, how much worse it would feel if you were doing something and you got bored of it, and then the adults pulled you away. So your last memory of it is being bored as hell.
Yeah, no, I know. Look, it doesn't mean that there are cruel masters who control our world, and even if they have reasons for doing the things they're doing, it's still cruelty. At the end of the day. Um, Before we adjourn, I did want to give you both an opportunity to plug like the projects that you have now, or the things that you most want people to. Actually, we'll divide into two things, because I know you're both very busy people. Plug one thing for people to look forward to, and one thing for people to go out and get right now.
Mhm. Um, so for me, one thing to go out and get right now is go to my website, possumcreekgames.com, snag a copy of Sleepaway, which is my big RPG release, or follow the link there to pre-order Wanderhome. That's all very cool. For the one thing that you can look forward to, uh, you should go to possumcreekgames.com. You should sign up for my mailing list, because pretty soon I'm going to be dropping an announcement about a pre-order for a thing that'll be coming out in a couple of months. It's an expansion for Sleepaway that's all about rituals and strangeness and the kind of more liminal edge of the camp space. We're getting back we're getting back Worthy, we're getting back the artists, and like just doing really cool stuff for it. I'm really got in hyped, and I'll be announcing that officially very soon once we get the cover. And you can you'll yeah, that's it. You should get that. It's gonna be good.
It sounds very cool.
That's
Mm-hmm,
very cool.
mm-hmm.
Gian, what about you?
Um, for something you should get right the heck now. I mean, obviously this book, but also,
I want something that gets you paid more.
honestly, the best thing for that would be my Patreon, because
Mm.
I'm being a lot more judicious with what I put up on itch, just because I am not tech phobic. I would say it just takes me a long time, and so the act of actually putting a game up on itch and making it look good, it just is really time consuming. Patreon is like my bucket for all the weird experimental shit that I make, and $5 gets you $5 a month gets you literally every single game that I make goes up on my Patreon. At $1 a month, you get all of the cool little experiments, as well as like essays about my thoughts on development and stuff like that. And the thing to look forward to that I'm doing is, James, I just sent you the link, is the Kickstarter that I am launching. Oh my god, in less than a week now.
God, wow.
In 5 days, I and my co-designer Shingen Core are going to be launching Field Guide to Memory. God, it's just so fucking cool. It's a month long interactive journaling game where you, as the player, create your own bespoke, completely unique physical book. So while the game itself is entirely non-physical, you get daily email prompts and a PDF if you want to play it in different pacing. As you go along, the prompts will have guide you toward like writing letters, journal entries, dream journals, pasting in cool shit you find, like leaf pressings or feathers. And Xing is designing some incredible, very cool physical ephemera that is directly from the PDF of the game. But those tiers, obviously, due to shipping costs and everything, are limited. So if you go to the pre-launch link and hit notify me, like you'll be one of the first to be informed, and you can jump on that tier quickly. It's so I'm so excited about this game. And one of the things that actually very exciting about it is I'm trying something new with the journaling game format, and I'm also creating a social group game that you can play on the weekends with friends as well, that takes place in the world. So yeah, keep an eye out for it. I've never done
I'm
a
so
project like this
excited.
before, and I'm excited. Yeah.
I am so excited.
Ooh, that sounds amazing. I mean, it really guided play or organized play. It's a lost art. So it is
Yeah.
very cool to see that design pop up.
And it's building on what I saw with Wait for Me, which was the first Kickstarter and also a journaling game where people were sharing stuff in real time on Twitter with the hashtag, and so you could look at other people's journals. And even though again it was like a solo game, there was a communal shared experience, and it was like really honestly quite beautiful. And in this one, you're playing the protege of this like renowned cryptid researcher who went missing in the field and is now presumed dead. and you're trying to get her research from the institution she used to work for so that you can carry on her legacy, but there's weird, shady, mysterious hurdles in the way. So that's the premise of the game.
Ah, I this is like so immaterial. I have a like half design for a Descended from the Queen game about people who go looking for a cryptid.
You have to tell me about this later. We got to talk about this later.
I just love the idea. Let's connect those two threads. Is you play that game and then you play the protege of the person from that game. It's too much. It's too much.
That's so good,
folks.
You gotta do it.
So good.
I love talking to these people. This has been such a delight. And thank you so much for hanging out with us for this. Before we go, I want to point out that if you enjoyed our discussion and you want to dive into these games yourself, you can pick up a copy of the Ultimate Micro RPG book. It is published by Adams Media, an imprint of Simon & Schuster, so it is everywhere. It is on pretty much every online retailer. It should be in all the big box bookstores, and it should be accessible in your local indie brick and mortar. You should definitely pick it up there if you can, because those indie bookstores need our support right now. If you want a good directory of where to find this book, head to bit.ly/ultimatemicroRPG, and that'll bring up the Simon & Schuster page for it, and they'll have a list of like different retailers that you can get this book. I really love this book. I hope everyone supports it because I would love to do more books like this, and dog hair. I would love to do more books like this. And more importantly, I would love for my publisher to see viability in people other than me leading collections like this. One of the feelings that I had as an editor is it is not really the role that I'm built for. And I worked with so many talented people on this book who I know would do a great job in that role. And I would love to be able to go to my publisher and say, hey, you should work with this person and have them develop their collection. I want more role-playing games in, mainstream stores, and I think this is one of the ways we can do that. Then, the last thing to note is we were here for charity. That charity is the World Builders Charity fundraising for Heifer International. It's a great organization, and both organizations are great organizations. And if you donate $10 or more, for every $10 you donate, you are entered into a pool of prizes and stuff that you can get from World Builders. Currently, we're raising for the one-shot page. You can find that at bit.ly/OSNends2020. And that page specifically has special draws for it. There are 25 draws for the first game that I published, Noisy Person Cards, which is kind of a rare commodity because Mattel bought that design and they distributed it through an exclusive distribution deal with Toys R Us. And they also redesigned it, so you can't get their version of it, and I am legally barred from selling my version of it, but I do have in my contract that I'm able to give them away charitably, and that's just what we're doing. So there are 25 slots for that game. It is a voice acting party game, a ton of fun, and only available here. There are also these...
Damn.
This is such a neat design tool that I want to highlight and talk about. The D&D page specifically, but also the one-shot page, has these. These are an invention of Pat Rothfuss. He came to everybody in that he knows in like tabletop games and was like, I want to create these business cards that have abilities in role-playing games on them. And by the authority of the person who designs the business card, you should be able to hand this card to you and pay for a specific thing. And a lot of them, are formed with D&D specific things. Like there's a card that, like, if you flip it, it'll either give you a 1 or a 20 on a roll or something. Mine is very
really cool.
Story focused. It is a business card that will provide you one improbable kiss in the game, so you can like summon that forward into the narrative.
Good.
It is. They are such cute ideas. I love them so much. The one-shot page is authorized for 100 new Skyjacks cards, Skyjack specific theme cards. The card is 8.3 times larger. Essentially, you can give that card over to your GM to turn any bird into a bird 8.3 times larger than it is. as a reference to our
Amazing.
giant birds in the Skyjacks universe. Cause some chaos with that, please. Please get that card and cause some chaos. Once again, go to bit.ly/OSNends2020 to check out our page and donate. Super worthy cause, super cool stuff that you can get from it. And again, thanks to all of our viewers for hanging out with us, and thanks so much, Gian and Jay, for talking.
Yeah, thank
this
you
was
so
Thank
much.
you for hosting. It was so good to see both of you.
It was so good. I'm so glad we had this excuse to hang out and chat with each other.
I
Me
know. It was
too.
perfect.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye,
Take
everybody.
care. Bye.